Howdy. My name is Zach Lawson, and I'd like to welcome you all here to the Veritas Forum at Texas A&M University. The Veritas Forum is a time for the Aggie community to come together and explore life's hardest questions. Our hope is that everyone here will be challenged. For those of you that identify with the Christian faith, we hope that you will be challenged to examine your own faith with the same intellectual honesty and rigor as our speaker tonight. For those of you that think of the Christian faith as something that's either mystifying or irrelevant or thoroughly disproven, we'll hope that you will be challenged by hearing from a Christian intellectual who can make a serious case for his faith in Jesus. The Veritas Forum at Texas A&M is sponsored by the Christian Faculty Network and co-sponsored by the Catholic Faculty and Staff Network and the student group Ratio Christi. Your feedback is extremely important in making these events successful. So as you came in tonight, you should have been given both a pencil and a response card. If you would go ahead and take the card out now and fill out the front part, that's just some information about you, your beliefs, and where you're coming from. Let's go ahead and take about 10 or 15 seconds and fill that out right now. All right, you can continue filling those out. At the end of tonight's lecture, if you would, just fill out the back side where you can give a review of tonight's talk. After the talk is over, as you exit, you will see a table with some baskets outside the theater. Just drop your card and your pencil off in those baskets. That'll be after everything's over with. The very last item will be the Q&A. After Dr. Budziszewski talks tonight, we'll have 2 live mics that you can come up to and ask questions. If you're like me and are terrified of public speaking, then you can use the hashtag on Twitter, hashtag VeritasTAMU2018, and also provide your questions in that way. That's all that I have, so at this time I'd like to invite Dr. Robert Garcia, Associate Professor of Philosophy here at Texas A&M, to introduce tonight's speaker.
Good evening. Thanks for coming this evening. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight. His name is Dr. J. Budziszewski. He earned his PhD from Yale in 1981. Since then, for almost 40 years, he's been teaching at the University of Texas at Austin. And he's a, yes. Be kind. He's a professor of government and philosophy. He's a prolific writer, very renowned. He's written, at this point, 13 books, including The Meaning of Sex, How to Stay Christian in College, and most recently 2 books on St. Thomas Aquinas, published by Cambridge University Press. Currently, he's working on book number 14, which will be on the meaning of happiness. His main area of research is the natural moral law, and he's most well known for his work on moral self-deception, what he calls the revenge of conscience, which is what happens when we tell ourselves that we don't know what we actually do know. If that sounds intriguing to you, you're in the right place, because his talk tonight is on what do we really know about right and wrong. Let's give Dr. Budziszewski a warm Aggie welcome.
Well, I really do appreciate that Aggie welcome, even though I do come from the enemy institution down the road. And I have to say, I love being in a place where the introducer can call out howdy and everybody yells howdy back. I'm in the right place. I want to talk about what we really know about moral right and wrong. There's all sorts of phony things that we tell ourselves about right and wrong, and we tell ourselves things like we don't know anything about it. But what do we really know about right and wrong? In a talk that he gave in the year 2005, the man who was soon to become Pope Benedict XVI lamented that, I quote, "We are building a dictatorship of relativism that does not recognize anything as definitive, and whose ultimate goal consists solely of one's own ego and desires." Now, I think some people must have found this statement confusing. He said the dictatorship of relativism does not recognize anything as definitive. But a dictatorship makes everything definitive, doesn't it? It defines what you must do, what you must not do. It defines what you must believe. It defines what you must not believe. Yet he said that the dictatorship of relativism does not recognize anything as definitive. Well, how then can it be a dictatorship? How can it be a dictatorship of relativism? Wouldn't relativism mean perfect freedom? 5 years later, in an interview with a German journalist, Benedict explained more fully. Relativism seems to be freedom, he said, for the sole reason that it is liberation from the previous situation. But in reality, he went on, this development increasingly leads to an intolerant claim of a new religion which pretends to be generally valid because it is reasonable, indeed because it is reason itself, which knows all and therefore defines the frame of reference that is now supposed to apply to everyone. In the name of tolerance, tolerance is being abolished. Now you can see how this works, can't you? Suppose we adopt a relativistic attitude about, say, just to choose something bland and non-controversial, the meaning of marriage. The old view is that marriage requires one man and one woman. First we ask, who is to say whether marriage is a union of one man with one woman? For instance, why not one woman and two men, or a half a dozen of each? Next we ask, how dare you discriminate? Since no one is to say what marriage is, you aren't allowed to say that it requires one man and one woman. Finally, we discriminate. In the name of non-judgmentalism, we judge. We say, you aren't allowed to insist upon the old view that marriage requires one man and one woman, but we are allowed to insist upon the new view that it doesn't. This becomes the official sexual creed in the law, in the public schools, and in polite society. What have we done here? In the name of tolerating all views, we've merely replaced one view with another. The view which used to define marriage is now defined as bigoted, and the view which used to define sexual disorder is now defined as what all right-thinking persons should believe. This is a strange inversion, and this strange inversion takes place in other spheres too. Saying, for instance, that no one should discriminate among faiths because no one knows what religion is true or what is true about God, or whether there is a God, we discriminate against the Christian faith because it holds that Christ is the way, the truth, and the life. We are saying that one must not believe that. Saying that one must suspend judgment because no one knows whether the unborn child is really a child. We discriminate against those who believe that he is a child and who want to protect him. And I really mean discriminate. They can even be prohibited from silently, peacefully praying too close to an abortion mill. Now you might think that only inconsistent relativists would behave the way that I describe. It may seem to you that although inconsistent relativists abolish tolerance in the name of tolerance, consistent relativists don't abolish anything. They really are tolerant. But stop and think for a moment. That would be impossible because there are no consistent relativists. There are none because there couldn't be any. If someone were relativistic about everything, among other things, he would have to be relativistic about tolerance itself. He would have to say, who is to say whether tolerance is right? It's all relative. It's all relative whether we tolerate one religion, 6 religions, or no religions. It's all relative whether we tolerate rape, murder, or popping chewing gum in movie theaters. It's all relative whatever we do. You see, a consistent relativist couldn't exist because if he were consistent, then he couldn't even be a relativist. He would have to say that relativism itself is relative. Now that's why relativism has to be inconsistent. And that's why it's never what it seems to be. so-called relativism, that which pretends to be relativism or neutrality or moral anti-realism or non-judgmentalism, is always a disguise for imposing one's own moral judgment without having to give reasons for it. On the older view, you had to give reasons for your moral judgments. But on the non-judgmentalist view, you don't have to give any reasons for your moral judgments because you're pretending that they aren't judgments. Don't get me wrong. There is such a thing as true tolerance, but it has nothing to do with relativism, nothing to do with asking who is to say, who is to judge. I think, in other words, that there is such a thing as a virtue of toleration, that it is a virtue, but it has to be properly understood and is not relativistic. In fact, the real reason for tolerating some views that we consider mistaken, or tolerating some acts that we judge to be wrong, is that the view that we judge to be true requires us to do so. Does that sound paradoxical? Well, I guess it is paradoxical, but I'll give you an example to illustrate what I have in mind. St. Hilary of Poitiers, who certainly didn't think that all coercion is wrong, did say that it's wrong to coerce people to worship. It's wrong to coerce people to worship. In other words, we should tolerate people who don't worship. Why? Did he take this view because who is to say whether there is a God? Or because who is to say whether God requires worship? No. In fact, he asserted that there is a God, and he said that God does require worship, but he said, God, this is a quote, God does not desire unwilling worship. Unwilling worship is not true worship. In other words, God is of such a nature that he abhors the coercion of conscience. Conscience, which is one of the things that he made. And this is something, according to St. Hilary of Poitiers, that we can know about him. We can judge this to be true. True tolerance, then, isn't relative. It isn't based on suspending judgment. It's based on making a judgment, making a better judgment. In this case, making a better judgment about the nature of that sort of faith which is pleasing to the true God. And if you can't make that judgment, then you have no idea whether you should tolerate anything, or if you should, which things you should tolerate. Now, I don't want to be mean to relativists. I want to give the relativists their due, because even if they are inconsistent, as inevitably they are, it isn't difficult to see why someone might think that everything is relative. Relativists typically believe that there are no reasonable grounds for judgment, that there simply are none. So it is all very well to say that true tolerance is based on judging better, as I do say, but in their view, no one can judge better. The very idea of judging better is an intellectual error. The truth and falsehood, right and wrong, good and evil, are in the eye of the beholder. That is a possible view. I say they have reasons for thinking this. What are some of the reasons, reasons for thinking that relativism is true? Now, please notice, if you will, how I worded that question just now. At the moment, I'm asking for the reasons for thinking relativism true, not the motives for thinking it's true. There's a difference. Someone might find it congenial to believe that, say, sexual morality is all relative because he's sleeping with his girlfriend, or that the morality of abortion is all relative because she's pregnant and he doesn't want her to be, or that the morality of killing is all relative because he talked her into having one. But those are not reasons for relativism. They're only motives for relativism. They are only temptations. A reason is something different. A reason is a ground for the reasonable judgment that something actually is true. A motive, by contrast, is merely a feeling that makes somebody want to believe that it is true. So I'm not asking about the motives for thinking that relativism is true. I will come back to motives later. Right now, I'm just asking for the reasons. I do think that the motives are psychologically important, but right now I'm asking about the reasons. Why do some people think, intellectually, that it might be true? At least 7, I would say, are common enough to be worth mentioning. At least 7 reasons for thinking that relativism might be true, and each of the 7 is based, I suggest, on a misunderstanding. Let me go through these. This isn't the only thing I'm going to be doing tonight, but let me discuss each of these 7 quickly. The first common reason that why some people fall into relativistic beliefs might be called the argument from variation. The argument from variation. Some norms really do vary according to circumstances. In the United States, for instance, it's wrong to drive on the right. It's not just that we don't drive on the left and that we do drive on the right. It would be wrong here to drive on the left. You'd cause a lot of accidents and so forth. In England, on the other hand, it's not that way. It's the opposite. It's wrong to drive on the right. So some norms obviously do vary. But notice the only way there can even be a valid difference in norms at the level of application is that there isn't any difference in norms at the level of basic principle. It is a universal moral principle, just as true in England as it is here, that we ought to take care for the safety of others. That includes the roads. But in the United States, lawmakers seek the safety of the people on the roads by making everybody drive on the same side, and it's going to be the right. And in England, they seek safety by making everybody drive on the same side, and it's going to be the left. In both cases, even though the norm is different, they're applying the same universal underlying principle, which is not different, and both ways of applying it work. One universal principle, 2 applications. So sometimes, not always, sometimes there's more than one way to skin a cat. But if you acknowledge that that cat is really there, that's not relativist. That's not a reason for relativism. The second common reason some people embrace relativism might be called the argument from difficulty. The argument from difficulty. Some moral questions are rather hard to answer, aren't they? For example, is all warfare murder? Some people respond to the difficulty of that question by saying that, well, murder is in the eye of the beholder. But would you say that the species of my pet is in the eye of the beholder, so that for me it's a cat, but for you it's a goldfish? I don't think so. But whether an act is murder is a question about species too. It's a question about the moral species of the act. If it's lazy to say that the biological species of my pet is in the eye of the beholder, then it's hard to see why it's not also lazy to say that the moral species of an act is in the eye of the beholder. The right thing to do about difficult questions isn't to pretend that they aren't difficult, but it also isn't to say, oh, they're difficult, so let's throw up our hands, they have no answer. The right thing to do about difficult questions is to carry out the difficult work of finding out what the answers are. Now, a close cousin of that last argument might be called the argument from disagreement. The argument from disagreement. People give different answers to some moral questions, don't they? They tend not to give different answers to all moral questions. Should parents take care of their children? Yes. But they give different answers to other things. Take the issue I mentioned a few minutes ago, warfare. Some people disagree about warfare. Some people say that all war is wrong. Others say only unjust war is wrong. Still others say that in war, everything goes, everything is permissible. So again, we might relapse into saying that the morality of war is relative, but in this case, because people disagree. But consider, the question about whether war is right or wrong is a question of fact. Either all war is wrong, or some war is wrong, or no war is wrong. When we are speaking of physical facts, such as whether the earth revolves around the sun, or the sun revolves around the earth, we unhesitatingly say that our task is to investigate the actual state of the matter and find out which opinion about the fact is correct. We ought to take the same view of moral facts and investigate. And in fact, that is what moral thinkers have been doing for centuries. This is why there is a theory of just warfare, for instance. Now, somebody might object to what I've just been saying. Somebody might object by proposing yet another argument for relativism. Well, let's call this one the argument from emotion. The argument from emotion. I spoke of moral facts. But according to people who adhere to the argument from emotion, there are no moral facts. There aren't any. And that propositions that seem to assert moral facts, for example, the proposition, murder is wrong, okay, or you should take care of your children, they seem to assert moral facts, but they're not. They're really only expressing the emotions of the speaker. For example, according to people who hold this view, if I say that it's wrong to deliberately run over children with automobiles, I seem to be saying something about the moral status of running over the children with automobiles. But on the critic's view, I'm really only saying something about me. I'm saying something about my feelings. I'm only saying that, that when I hear of such an act, so-and-so drove over some children with an automobile or tried to do so, that I become angry, or I become disgusted, or I become indignant. These are emotions. And he says, that's all that's really going on. You dress it up with language about right and wrong and so forth, as though there are moral facts, but you're really not talking about a moral property of the act. You're talking about the properties of your emotions at the time. But wait a moment. People do get sometimes angry or indignant or disgusted. And in fact, I would feel angry or indignant or disgusted if I heard of such an act. But isn't it reasonable to say to me, when you hear of such an act, why do you feel that way? The reason that it makes me feel that way is that I judge it to be wrong. And it would still be wrong, by the way, even if it didn't make me feel that way. Even if I could contemplate the running over of children without feeling angry, disgusted, or indignant. And that's not all. Think of it. The argument from emotion doesn't actually give anyone a reason to disbelieve in moral facts. It doesn't give anyone a reason to disbelieve in them. It merely assumes that there are none and then tries to explain moral statements on the basis of that assumption. Picking an assumption and then trying to explain things on the basis of that assumption is a different thing than demonstrating that the assumption is true. Very few of those who offer the argument from emotion offer a reason for the assumption. You might find the argument from emotion attractive if you are already a relativist, but it doesn't give you a very reasonable warrant for being a relativist. Still another reason for relativism might be called the argument from tautology or the argument from circularity. A certain U.S. judge, who I will not name, has claimed that although there may be a few universal moral principles, they don't really amount to anything, they don't really say anything, because they're tautologies. He says they're circular statements. For instance, you may think that when you say, thou shalt not commit murder, you're actually identifying a particular kind of act that shouldn't be done. And he says, no, you're not. When you say, thou shalt not murder, you're really saying nothing more than never commit the kinds of killing that you ought not commit, which is entirely circular. It says nothing. But the argument from tautology actually is even lazier than the previous argument. Because if you examine what moral thinkers of the centuries have said about murder, They don't just tell us, don't do what is not to be done in a circular fashion. Rather, they identify specifically what kind of an act murder is or what kind of an act theft is, and they say, don't do that. They tell us what murder is. The core of the definition, leaving aside some of the details, is that murder is deliberately taking innocent human life. Whenever an act fits that definition, it must never be done. If it doesn't fit that definition, then it may or may not be permissible, depending on other moral considerations. That's not a circularity. Well, what else? Here's one. This is what I call the argument from progress. The argument from progress. A former chairman of the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee, who later became a vice president of the United States, once complained about someone who had been nominated for the Supreme Court. He wrote a very famous op-ed piece in the New York Times about this. He said that the nominee seemed to believe in, I quote, a static set of unchanging moral principles. And he thought that was bad. He said what you ought to believe in is an evolving body of ideals. Believing in a static set of unchanging moral principles, in other words, was wrong. You should believe that ideas evolve according to the time and place, and so he was a relativist. Now, the funny thing is that although the senator's statement was relativistic, because it denied that there are any universal moral principles, at the same time it insisted that there are universal moral principles. He was trying to have it both ways. How so? Well, consider. What did the senator mean by saying that moral ideals evolve? That moral ideals evolve. I don't think he meant that they undergo arbitrary and meaningless change. Because you notice, he approved of this evolution. He didn't mean by evolution of moral ideals just that today we believe murder is wrong, tomorrow we believe murder is not wrong, then we believe it's wrong again. No, he thought that there is a movement in our moral ideals from worse to better. So what he really meant is that our moral ideals are getting better. Well, that may be true, it may not be true. Never mind whether that statement is true or not, but just think about it. To suggest that they are changing for the better implies a fixed standard of moral comparison. If you're going to say one stick is longer than another, you need a yardstick that works for all sticks. You know, if you want to say that one pot took longer to boil than another pot, you need a clock that you can use on all boiling pots. So even in order to say that our moral ideals have no fixed content but get better, he needed a moral standard to judge how good they were, which doesn't change. So this argument for relativism is self-defeating. Last but not least, there's what might be called the argument from false humility. The argument from false humility. This argument for relativism suggests that to make a moral judgment is to commit the vice of pride. To commit the vice of pride. And this is maybe the most common argument for relativism. But do you notice that there's a certain difficulty with it? This is anti-judgmentalism, right? You shouldn't judge. Who are you to judge? You must think that you're better than all the rest of us. What's strange about that is that if no one may judge anybody else, then how is it that we're allowed to deliver an unfavorable judgment on those who do judge? If you can't judge at all, then how can you judge that the people who judge are bad folks? Obviously, you can't. Now, I'm speaking in a Christian venue. Many people of all faiths, people of no faith, people of all sorts of beliefs, have been invited here, and you're all welcome. But of course, my sponsors are Christian, and I think then there are going to be some Christians in the audience, and some of them might be disturbed that I dismiss the argument from false humility so quickly, that I even call it an argument from false humility. For didn't Christ command, "Judge not, that you must not be judged"? Didn't he say that? Well, sure he did. But don't forget what he said next. He said, by way of explanation, "For with the measure you pronounce, you will be judged, and the measure you give will be the measure you get. You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you'll see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye." Well, now, if you have to first take the speck out of your own eye, and then you can see clearly to take, the log out of your own eye, then you can see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye, that doesn't mean you can't judge at all. It means you've got to get that log out of your eye first. Plainly, this statement expresses a moral judgment. It expresses a moral judgment. It does not condemn all moral judgment. It condemns proud and hypocritical moral judgment. Lest there be any doubt about that, you might remember another place in the Gospels. We don't want to be selective quoters, right? We might remember another place in the Gospels where Christ said, "Do not judge by appearances, but judge with right judgment." Now, that's not a prohibition of judgment. That statement is especially striking because at the same time that in the other statement, he's forbidding one kind of moral judgment, or even here, he's forbidding one kind, don't judge by appearances. He commands another kind of judgment, judge with right judgment. So humility really is a virtue. But true humility does not mean, cannot mean, suspending all moral judgment. And if you did try to do that, you couldn't even say that humility was a virtue, could you? Well, so much for the reasons for relativism. I've shown that it's impossible for relativists to be consistent. I've shown that the reasons which move some people intellectually to relativism don't hold water. I want to say a little bit about the motives. I said I would come back to them. The motives for relativism, but not much more need to be said about them. Very few people today are relativists about things like banditry, anyway. Even bandits tend to say, not that the right and wrong of banditry is all relative, but that their sort of banditry doesn't really count as banditry. You know, that's a very old sort of excuse. Thomas Aquinas, back in the 1200s, commented on this. He pointed out that this is what the ancient German tribes said when they raided other tribes. They hated banditry. They used to execute bandits and other criminals by burning them to death. They hated bandits, and yet they raided other tribes. They didn't admit that what they were doing was banditry. Well, if people aren't usually relativists about banditry, then about what sorts of things are they relativists? That's not really very hard to guess, is it? People today are relativists mostly about sex. I don't know if that's always been the case. Perhaps in another age, people might be relativists mostly about theft. You know, they might pull out the relativist card when they want to justify killing. But in our day, people are relativists mostly about sex and indirectly about things that are connected with sex, associated with sex, such as abortion. Why? Because they don't want to be judged for having sex when they shouldn't, and they don't want to. They want to have this sex and don't want to be judged about it. Non-judgmentalism, you see, is only incidentally about not judging others. What it's really about, I think, psychologically, is mostly not judging me. Not judging me. And if the only way to escape judgment of my own sexual behavior is to exempt all sex and sex-related behavior of anybody from judgment, then it will be tempting to do so. But wait. Am I being too hasty? For although I've argued that relativism about everything is impossible, I haven't presented an argument that relativism about some things is impossible. Perhaps someone might concede there are universal moral rules about, say, banditry and slavery and torture and female circumcision, but say that there aren't any universal moral rules about sex. So that although it makes no sense to be a universal moral relativist, perhaps it does make sense to be a relativist just about this one thing. And I would say that this is where many of us are. If someone sneaks off with my DVR, I say theft is wrong. If someone pulls a knife on me, I say robbery and violence are wrong. Those things aren't relative. But if I sleep with my girlfriend, I say, who is to judge? Who is to judge? What's right for you might be wrong for me. So this raises the question, is there any right and wrong? I'll continue with this example for a few minutes. We could talk about some other example. We could talk about the ethics of life and death. We could talk about the ethics of lying. We could talk about the ethics of anything. But since this is the thing that we're most tempted to be relativists about, let's continue with sex for a little while. Is there any right and wrong about sex outside marriage? Is there any reason to think that there's any objective moral rule about this at all? The most common reason for thinking that there isn't is expressed in the saying, it doesn't hurt anyone. It doesn't hurt anyone. But you know, do we really believe that? In order to believe that it doesn't hurt anyone, you must be pulling a very large piece of wool over a very squinty set of eyes. Consider just a few of the fruits of the sexual revolution. You know, my generation was, I don't know if this is lucky or unlucky, that the consequences of their acts didn't catch up on them and were mostly visited upon the next generation. But consider just a few of the fruits of the sexual revolution. Loneliness and lack of true intimacy. Because you know, sex is like duct tape. If you keep sticking it on and pulling it off and sticking it on and pulling it off, eventually it can no longer bond. And you lose the capacity for intimacy. Another consequence, emptiness. Because such a powerful force built into us as sexual longing needs to mean something, and we treat it as though it means nothing. Fatherlessness. Because single women get pregnant with no one to help them raise the children. And you may say that a child doesn't need both a mom and a dad, but a child does. And it's a very sad and tragic thing if that is not possible. Atheism, because boys raised without fathers find it difficult to trust God as Father. Poverty, because women must so often provide for their children by themselves. That's hard. Adolescent difficulty and disorientation and criminality, because children who are missing their father, or their mother for that matter, have a harder time growing up. Venereal disease, because formerly rare infections spread rapidly through sexual contact. When I was young, I remember that physicians used to think about only maybe 2 or 3 sexually transmitted diseases. Now they have to think about, on an everyday basis, about 20 or more. Child abuse, because live-in boyfriends tend to resent their girlfriends' babies. And live-in girlfriends tend to sacrifice their children for their boyfriend's approval. Divorce, because wantonness leads to betrayal. Abortion, because children are increasingly regarded as a burden rather than as a joy and a gift. All that, and yet we still excuse our conduct by saying, it doesn't hurt anyone. Who are we fooling? All of these problems existed before, of course. All of them. Every one of them existed before, but they are much worse now. And I beg you, please don't tell me that they'll all be solved by chemical contraception. Let's not play that game. Isn't it curious that these problems have all become so much worse after the invention and spread of chemical contraception? Did you know that? Actually, not many people do know that, but it's plainly true. It's right there in the statistics. Out of wedlock, it isn't as though, it was expected that with the invention of chemical contraception, out of wedlock pregnancy would disappear. Precisely the opposite has happened. After the invention of chemical contraception, out of wedlock pregnancy soared. Does that suggest something to you? It suggests something to me. It suggests that contraception isn't the solution to this problem, it's part of the problem. Contraception hasn't changed the rules of sexual morality, as people sometimes think. It's merely provided us with new excuses for thinking that we don't have to follow them. We are living an illusion, which will eventually collapse when the social damage becomes great enough. In the words of the poet T.S. Eliot, We're dreaming of systems so perfect that no one will have to be good. Now, I'd like you to notice something. Not once in this brief argument for sexual purity that I've just presented have I ever said, the Bible says. Not once have I said, the Catechism says, or even my favorite religious teacher says. In fact, I've deliberately restricted myself to the criterion of morality that secularists tend to use. The thin and inadequate catchphrase that whatever doesn't hurt anyone is morally okay. All I've done is pointed out grave and growing ways in which we do hurt each other, ways that we pretend to ignore. I don't see anything. So although I am a Christian, and I am speaking in a Christian forum, I'm not speaking about, quote, Christian morality, as though it were only something to be found in the Bible. I'm speaking about morality for everyone, even though it isn't accepted by everyone. And since I am speaking about morality for everyone, there's no reason why people like me shouldn't be able to offer such arguments in the public square, although they're often beaten over the head for doing so and told that's just some religious view. It should be possible to offer an argument like this to anyone, irrespective of his religious convictions or his lack of them, right there in the public square. People who tell people like me, promoting so-called sexual purity reflects an irrational animus, or stop cramming your Christian morality down my throat, have actually got it backwards. They are expressing an irrational animus against human morality, and they are the ones cramming it down others' throats. I'm defending human morality, which is humane, ultimately compassionate morality, because it's necessary for our flourishing, for our thriving, for our well-being, for our happiness. And I'm trying to make headway by nothing but rational persuasion. Now, I use sexual morality as an example, but now let's leave that aside. I said let's go with that for a few minutes. Let's push it aside. What else can we say about human morality? Only sex? No, we can talk about a lot of things. Is it difficult to figure out? Not really. Not really. Although some of the details of human morality are hard to figure out. By human, I mean not necessarily accepted by every human, but suitable for every human, because they are how we need to live to thrive. Although some of the details are hard to figure out, as I mentioned earlier in connection with the justice of war, the general principles are not at all hard to figure out. In fact, not only is it not hard to know them, but they are already known and have been known for thousands of years and substantially acknowledged by all human cultures. One of the very best summaries of the moral law that we possess, it is a summary, it isn't intended to be an exhaustive list, but is the Ten Commandments. To make it work as a summary, you have to understand that each of the things the Ten Commandments mention is a sort of a placeholder for a lot of other things, okay? So that, for instance, do not commit adultery has to do with all aspects of sexual purity. Do not bear false witness is about all aspects of truthfulness. But the worst example of unchastity or the worst example of untruthfulness is used to stand for the whole. Okay, so it's a terrific summary. Now at this point you might want to protest. You might say, we knew that if we waited long enough we'd hear you trip yourself up. 10 Commandments, eh? So when you said that you weren't speaking just of Christian morality, you lied. You pestilent professor. You wayward malcontent. You globe of lying continents. You milk-livered hugger-mugger. You have less brain than earwax. Substantially acknowledged by all human cultures, did you say? Did you think that we wouldn't notice that the 10 Commandments are just from your own Bible? Well, yeah, they are in the Bible, but they're in lots of other places too. The biblical Decalogue, the biblical Ten Commandments, is merely a more perfect expression of the natural law, which is dimly known everywhere. People in every place and time recognize that it's good to honor parents. People in every place and time recognize that it's wrong to be unfaithful to their spouses, and so on, even though they may fudge the details, and even though they may not live up to them. But that raises a question, and with this I'm going to conclude. If the moral law really is dimly known everywhere, then why don't we live up to it? Why don't we live up to it? Our problem is this. The moral law is universal, but the desire to escape it is universal too. Consider cannibals. The problem isn't that the cannibals are ignorant of the wrong of deliberately taking innocent human life. The problem with the cannibals is that they pretend not to know that the fellows in the other tribe are human. Does that seem ludicrous? Let's not preen ourselves on our superiority to the cannibals. We do much the same thing. Their pretense that the fellows in the other tribe are not human is no more ludicrous than our pretense that the baby in the womb is not human. It's no more ludicrous, for that matter, than most of our pretenses. For instance, that living together without vows is good practice for living with vows, or that vows are not really vows and may be broken. I dare to say that concerning the basic principles of morality, the big-ticket items, no one is truly ignorant. The thief knows the wrong of theft. The murderer knows the wrong of murder. The God-mocker knows the wrong of mocking God. But there is a great deal of denial, a great burden of self-deception, a great number of cunning lies. The difficulty is that the problem of right and wrong is not just a problem of knowledge. Knowledge isn't the problem. It's mainly a problem of will. A law is truly written on the heart of man, but it is everywhere entangled with the evasions and subterfuges of men. And that's why I suggest here in this Christian forum, where I might be expected by some people to say something different, that the originality of Christian teaching about morality is not what it says about right and wrong. What? Honor your father and mother? Where do you get such an outlandish idea? No, that's not what's original about Christian teaching about morality. The moral basics belong to the patrimony, the inheritance of the whole human race. The originality of Christian teaching about morality lies elsewhere, because it's not enough to know the truth deep down. I may know it, but prefer not to know it. I may know it, but tell myself that I don't know it. I may know it, but live as though I don't know it. To live in that way is to deny the very truth of my being. It is to be unfree. To be truly free is to be true to myself, is to be true to the image of God, which is myself. And to do that, I must want true freedom, and I must want it more than I want this vanity of vanities that I call my freedom. I must want to know the truth, and this can happen in only one way. I must be converted into truth. All my dross must be burned away so that nothing untrue is left in me. How much do I want that? It's too little to want it a little, for I must want it completely. Not for nothing has it been said that the pure in heart shall see God. Do I dare to desire that which I tremble to conceive? Do I want to be loved by that which loves me more than I love myself? After my last ruse and disguise has failed, my last refuge has been penetrated, and I'm finally cornered by this truth, will I at least yield myself to truth, to be scoured and polished and made honest until I can give back that light? If I cannot yield, am I at least willing to want that I should yield? If I cannot even want it, if I'm not willing to want it, am I at least willing to want to be willing that I should want it. And at least will I yield to being helped. I've been saying will I yield? Forgive me for talking to myself. Will you? Thank you. Okay, what happens now here?
Howdy.
Here
Sorry,
we
here I am. Howdy. My name is Micah Green. I'm the president of the Christian Faculty Network here, and it's now time for some Q&A. The main way we can do that is through these two microphones up front. Also, if you're very shy, you can also tweet questions in using the hashtag Veritas TAMU 2018. While y'all are thinking about good questions and making your way to the microphone, I'll get us primed with a couple just to get us started. So,
and if you are feeling too shy, you don't have to. I may be ugly, but I'm not mean.
Very good. So I'll get us started. So I've noticed that empiricists are quick to say, we can get everyone to agree on scientific facts because they're objective. Something's objective. You and I can look at it. We say the laws of thermodynamics are what they are. It's objective. But they're bothered by disagreements. If two people can't disagree on moral norms, how can they be objective?
Well, this is overlooking the plain facts of the matter. People disagree about the physical facts too. For centuries, some people said, well, the sun shines because it's a sun god, and he's pulling a gleaming chariot across the sky. Other people thought that it was a ball of molten fire. Other people thought that it was something else. And by investigation and by reasoning and by observation and by trying to take such facts as we knew as far as we can and figure things, we finally did come to realize that, yes, it's not any of those things, and it isn't going around us, we're going around it, and it's a big ball of fusing hydrogen and some helium. It's the same thing. More progress has been made in moral matters too. We find that some things don't work. And we find that some things run against the grain of our own nature, and we learn things. Disagreement exists in every field, and the way that you find your way out of disagreement is to carefully reason together.
Okay. Hey, thanks for coming to speak. Earlier on, you talked about the idea that ideas or ideals should evolve.
That the idea that what?
Ideas should evolve.
Oh, yes,
From the
so-called argument from progress, right.
Yes. So, and then you followed that up by saying that it didn't stand firm because it is based off of the idea that morality is getting better. Mm-hmm. Is that correct?
I said such a view is not.
Okay.
I said such a person is assuming that there is something that doesn't evolve, the standard by which you judge that things are getting better.
So my question is actually about how you're talking about evolution, because from what I know of evolution, it's not so much that things are getting better, but things are adapting to their environment.
Oh, you're talking about biological evolution.
Is the word different for philosophy?
It is true that according to the theory of natural selection, things only persist in the genome if they have an adaptive advantage for the organism, or according to some versions of the theory for the group or for the species. But I'm talking about the person who was expressing this view was talking about social evolution, not biological evolution. By evolution, he just meant things change in a certain direction over time. That's all he meant. He used the word evolve, but what he meant was they progress in a good direction. I mean, the question of adaptation, that wasn't even on the table. He wasn't even considering that.
Okay.
Okay? All right, good. Well, that was easy. Thank you.
Let's go to the other side now. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for coming to speak. I have
Glad to be here.
two kind of questions. I kind of build off each other, if it's okay.
Well, okay, we'll see. I'll let you ask one of them.
I can ask one. That's fine. Here in the state, regarding moral law with murder, here in the state of Texas, capital punishment is considered legal. And my question is capital punishment justified in state of Texas and other states where it is legal by moral law or by the argument of emotion?
By moral law or by what?
The argument of emotion.
Of the notion?
Of emotion.
Of emotion. Okay, I'm not interested in arguments from emotion. I don't think that that demonstrates anything about whether capital punishment is correct. But I will talk about whether I think capital punishment is moral. The classical natural law tradition, this is commonly misunderstood. The classical natural law tradition, and I agree, holds that murder is deliberately taking innocent human life. All right? The criminal who is being executed is not innocent. This is not murder. It might still be wrong if death is not a proportionate punishment to the gravity of what he did. Although in many cases it is proportionate. Somebody kills 3,000 people. It seems hard to believe that taking his life is not proportionate. So capital punishment it may not always be right, but whatever it is, it's not murder. There are some people who think that capital punishment is rarely, if ever, necessary anymore, that it should be a last resort to be used only reluctantly, and that today we don't need to use it as often because we have prisons where we can lock people up forever. That may be true, and I'm not going to argue against that view here, but if the question is it murder? No, it's not.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Excuse me. So tonight we talked about where we arrived at the moral standard, and if we agree that God is perfect, holy, and all-powerful, my question for you is, why then, if God is good, does he allow terrible things to happen in the world? So A, what man causes, but beyond that, things such as hurricanes, cancer, earthquakes, and the like.
Well, there are two ways to answer this question, and it depends on really where the question is coming from. Sometimes what's desired is a sort of a blackboard solution. Prove as a theorem that a good God who is all-powerful could permit evil. And there are a variety of blackboard solutions, many of which I consider highly persuasive. For instance, there is the argument that I find this very persuasive, that much of the evil in the world arises from our own actions. In order to prevent that, God would have had to make us unfree. But if he'd made us unfree, he couldn't make us in his image. He would have made something much less excellent than he did make. He wanted to make beings that, like him, could recognize truth. Now, he's the source of truth. We only receive it. But in our finite way, could recognize truth, and that as he is love, that we could love in return. You know, love is not, something that is coerced can never be love, so we would have to be free. If we're free to love, we're free to refuse to love, and we're free to do evil. Or take the hurricanes. If there were no danger in the world, if there were no peril in the world, if there were no things to bravely resist, there would also be no opportunity to develop virtues like courage. And some people have argued, and I think that so far as it goes, this is pretty persuasive, that a world in which it is possible, because of peril, to develop the virtue of courage is a world that is better than one in which it's not possible. Now, I will concede, and there are lots of other arguments like this, I will concede that these arguments aren't utterly and completely satisfying. They don't wipe away all questions. And I think that's true. So there's another way to ask it. Instead of considering a blackboard solution to the problem, which is a job for philosophy, one might pose the question in a different way, the way that it faces the ordinary individual in his life, the existential question. If God is like that, why am I suffering? And as a Christian, I would say the best answer to that is we don't know all the reasons, but we know what kind of God he is. This is the God who, seeing our suffering, took pity on us and took the worst of it upon himself on the cross for us. If he's that kind of God, I think I can trust him with the rest of the question until I find out the rest of the answer. Mm-hmm.
Hi, so you've been talking tonight about ethical philosophy.
Yes.
And my question is whether this sort of approach in philosophical ethics has ramifications for political philosophy. So for example, if there's a universal ethical unchanging standard for action, for the choosing the right and wrong thing to do, and if there's an also universal impulse in people to try and escape that natural law, it seems like something like a democracy with universal suffrage may not be the best way to find answers to political problems.
Well, it at least means that something like a democracy with universal suffrage is not necessarily always the best way. I think that, yes, this does have ramifications for political philosophy. Before I was an ethical theorist, I was a political theorist, and I think that politics requires an ethical foundation. Now, in some ways, it's more difficult to do political philosophy than it is ethical philosophy, because even if you know, for instance, that the general moral premises, moral precepts that are contained in the Decalogue are true, that doesn't just bang tell you, like proving a theorem, this is the kind of government we should have. Let's see, there should be separation of powers, and it doesn't tell you that. A lot of these kinds of things about how to organize politics, we do not learn by deduction from first moral principles, like we do geometry, but rather we learn them in large part by experience. Okay? And some of the universal truths, though, do have some implications for how we should interpret that experience. If we recognize, for instance, that there is a universal moral law, but that we're universally trying to escape it, then our political institutions are going to have to recognize that fact. And this is why, for instance, natural law philosophers have said that all sin is wrong, but not every sin should be a crime, because sometimes in the very effort of trying to suppress an evil, you might bring about a greater evil. And you have to use judgment, and that's not just a matter of proving things from theorems. Okay? Yes.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Let me go ahead and interject with a quick Twitter question, because I don't want to ignore these people.
Okay.
So Christians typically, it's here, that's from me, it's not up there. So someone asked about the Euthyphro Dilemma. Christians typically believe that moral norms come from a moral lawgiver and God, and the Euthyphro Dilemma asks, does God command things because they are good, or are things good because God commands them?
Okay, before I answer that, I had thought that Twitter question was going to be on the screen.
No.
And so I want to point out to you that my name
There's
is
a misspelling, yes.
There's actually another Z, so if you can look online and if you want to know, if you have the bizarre desire to know the spelling of my name, but don't believe that. Okay. Back to the Euthyphro Dilemma. It's called the Euthyphro Dilemma because the classical formulation of this was in a dialogue, a conversation between Socrates and a fellow named Euthyphro. You can put it like this: Does God tell us to do the moral thing because morality is higher than God and so He's obeying, or is it rather that He tells us to do the moral thing because whatever He says to do is moral just by the fact that He commanded it? Now, both of those two alternatives seem objectionable. One means that God isn't God; He isn't the supreme thing. There's something above Him, and that's morality. The other one says that God is just an arbitrary tyrant, and He makes up weird stuff that has no basis in anything, and we have to call that right just because He said. The classical solution to this dilemma, which is also my solution, is that yes, both of those alternatives are wrong, but you know that both of us, whether you say morality is higher than God or God is higher than morality, both of those two alternatives assume that God and what is right are something different. God is identical with His own justice and His own goodness. You know, the very distinction between God and that morality that flows from Him is wrong in the first place. When you look into the heart of justice, into the heart of love, into the heart of goodness, you find not an abstraction, but you find a person. He is identical with that which He commands to us. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. My question is this. We have this moral law, and you didn't open the Bible in order to prove it. Could you do the same thing with having like a universal punishment of some sort, like not opening the Bible?
I must have missed a phrase. You said we have a universal moral law, and then you said something about looking in a Bible.
Yeah, the fact that you didn't look in one, so you didn't use any evidence from the Bible at all.
In my talk, right?
So how would that entail for like a punishment for breaking a moral law?
Okay. What question about punishment would you want to ask? Is there such a thing as a punishment that is always right?
Yes.
Okay. No, I think punishments are not always right. The same punishments are not always right. If a child takes something that isn't his, He should be treated differently than an adult who takes something that isn't his. Even if we're talking about different countries or different cultures, if there is a society in which people are used to robbing each other, they're just in the habit, okay? I'm going to have to work very slowly and gradually to try to teach honesty and justice and honoring each other's property to such a people. I can't do it all at once, whereas I can start out with good laws with people who aren't like that. So, you know, punishments have to take account of all of these kinds of things. Ideally, punishment should fit the crime. It should be proportional to the crime. You give the person what he deserves. But those aren't the only considerations.
Thank you.
Yes.
I just wanted to say thank you for coming to speak tonight. And
Thank
my
you.
question was, I have a lot of friends that consider themselves pretty staunch libertarians, and they hold to the non-aggression principle. And one of the kind of philosophical outtakes from the non-aggression principle that my friends believe, they believe that there isn't a crime unless there's a victim. And like you were talking about earlier with the sexual revolution, again, that can be pretty blinding. So what kind of a response should I give to my friends?
Well, just like when I was talking about the precept that it's okay if it doesn't hurt anybody, that can be expressed similarly. It's not a crime if there is no victim. To say, but it does hurt people, is to show that there are victims. I would say more. I think there's something to be said for libertarianism. We have liberties. There are certain liberties that ought to be honored because of what kinds of beings we are. We're not things, we're persons. We're not whats, we're whos. There's a dignity that attaches to the human being. As a matter of fact, we can't even do our duties unless we have certain liberties. How can I seek the truth about God if I don't have the liberty to seek the truth about God? However, I think that if a libertarian tries to operate on liberties alone, he's not going to be able to explain why there are any liberties. He's going to have to investigate things like, well, what is a human person then? And why these liberties and not those liberties? What is their connection with duties? And how are they good for us? Oh, what is good, in fact? What is bad? And this is going to lead him into all kinds of other things. And the next thing that you know, he's going to be a full-blooded natural law thinker. Okay? And I wish that more libertarians would do that. A few do. They call themselves libertarians only because they think all they mean is that liberties are terribly important, but they don't mean liberties are all I believe in.
All right. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you for the talk. I guess my question is about, you've talked a lot about content that we know in the natural law. And my question is more about the kind of thing that we know and how to know it. So if I want to know the natural law, do I need to go and consult Scripture, Revelation? Do I need to go out and do empirical investigation?
Okay.
Or do I need to sit on my armchair and try to, discern abstract
Very good question.
truths?
Yeah, okay. Well, first of all, the first thing that we need to recognize is that we're not the first persons to have thought about these things. People have been thinking about these things for centuries and centuries, and we don't have to reinvent the wheel. So it's helpful to study the greatest work that has been done on this before. Now, those great thinkers, what did they do? You mentioned Scripture. I would say Scripture is very helpful. But you notice sometimes people say, oh, just do Scripture alone. Don't pay any attention to the natural law. That's not in the Bible. The only way you know anything about right and wrong is by reading the Bible. If you try to be faithful to Scripture in that sense, you're not even going to be faithful to Scripture because Scripture itself points to the natural law. For instance, St. Paul speaks about certain sexual behavior as being contrary to nature that implies a natural standard. He says a certain law is written on the heart. That means our nature is such that we have a conscience. He says to the fool, don't you know that as you sow, so you will reap? That's calling attention to the witness of natural consequences. Even if you'd never heard of a Bible, you would know about the witness of natural consequences. You could pay attention to it. You experience your conscience. You can pay attention to that. You can recognize the way that you are made and certain fundamental features of yourself, like the fact that men and women are different from each other and yet need each other. These things all have implications for how we live. Now, when you work out these implications, it may take a long time, and it did take a long time in the tradition to work them out. But what you find is that you end up after a long process. And if you're interested in where to read about this, I might suggest, for instance, the Question 94 of the Treatise on Law of Thomas Aquinas is a great place to start. What you find is that, as I said earlier, a great summary of natural law morality basically it's in the Bible too. It is the Ten Commandments. But you can't just stop with the Ten Commandments. You know, the Ten Commandments signifies, okay, it uses the worst kind of lying, which is false witness, to signify the wrong of lying in general. But what is a lie? That requires some philosophical thinking, right? It says you should not steal, indicating that we should have respect for the property of others. But how do I know when that property is his and when it isn't? There's some more thought that has to be given here. We can recognize immediately and spontaneously, and it's in the Bible too, it's a matter of both biblical law and natural law, honor your parents. But what does that honor include? What exactly do I owe my parents by way of honor? You know, these things have to be worked out more. But I think that they can be. Okay? Great. All right. Thank you for your question.
Howdy.
Hi.
A few minutes ago, you said that capital punishment shouldn't be considered murder because the criminal shouldn't be considered innocent. But of course, nobody's perfect. So I was wondering, without being relativistic, of course, how would you define innocence?
Well, the person who is, let's say, executed for pulling a gun on 5 people in a grocery store is not being executed because he is not a perfect person. He's being executed because he committed a terrible crime. You know, and we just need to make some distinctions. And not all sins, not all crimes are equal. Some really are worse than others. Some have to be punished, and they should be punished in a way that is commensurable to the deed.
Thank you.
Sure.
So a quick note, I'm going to try to cut us off at 8:30. So that means at 8:28 we're going to go into lightning round mode. So anyway, go ahead.
Now, the question there isn't whether they can ask the questions fast enough, but whether I can answer them fast enough. Go ahead, please.
I was just wondering, you were talking about warfare earlier.
Uh-huh.
And I was wondering if there's such a thing as good versus wrong warfare, because we know that God engages in warfare between good and evil.
Yes, one of the branches of the natural law tradition is concerned precisely with those questions. You can distinguish it into 2 parts. First, there is the question of when it may be legitimate to engage in warfare. And the second is the question of how you have to do it. Now, notice that this is not a question, when is it right to murder? The answer to the question, is it ever right to murder, is never. And murder is still wrong, even in war. For instance, the guy isn't shooting you anymore. He throws down his weapons. I surrender. And you shoot him in the stomach. You've murdered. That's not an act of just warfare. Okay, I said that just war theory asks 2 questions. When may you go to war? It takes in, I'm not going to give you a complete sketch here, but it considers things like, is there a just cause? What was the intention? Was the intention for the war that cause, or was it something else, and you're just using that cause as an excuse? Is it reasonable to expect that greater good would result from the war than the inevitable evils that are going to transpire? Have you tried other things, made all reasonable efforts to settle the problem short of war? Is the war being waged by competent public authority rather than just by vigilantes? You know, all of those kinds of criteria have to be satisfied first. As to how you wage the war, The most important criterion here, that isn't already suggested by the ones about how to go to war, is what's called the discrimination principle. It means you must distinguish between innocence and not innocence, between combatants and non-combatants. To deliberately target non-combatants and innocents is always wrong. Okay? And yes, that's a branch of the natural law tradition, and it's very important. It's very interesting because in most of the wars of the United States, Americans tended to assume that their wars were just, but they actually weren't using the criteria of the natural law tradition to think about this. It's only fairly recently that in our armed forces and in policy-making circles that just war theory has been explicitly consulted.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Howdy. So I'd say in Christian scriptures, there's kind of like a contained form of relativism or subjectivism that's proposed by Paul when he talks about sinning against your conscience. So in like 1 Corinthians, it's like meat sacrificed to idols. If you consider it a sin and engage in it, even if it's not, you've sinned because you've done something deliberately that you thought was wrong.
Okay,
right?
I understand the difficulty. This is actually, the difficulty that you're pointing to has been extensively discussed in the natural law tradition. There are two things. Your conscience can be mistaken.
Mm-hmm.
However, so long as it is mistaken, nevertheless it is your conscience. You must not do wrong, and you must not disobey the sincere and settled judgment of your conscience. The only way to escape doing wrong, therefore, is that your conscience is well formed. Right. That it's not a messed up conscience that thinks that things that are wrong are really right, or things that are right are really wrong. You have to do both of those things.
So my question is, how do we kind of avoid the pitfalls of relativism that you just talked about while trying to align our conscience?
Well, if we do try to align our conscience with the moral law, if we do bring ourselves under the influence of those who have something to teach us about this, and try to allow our consciences to be well formed, then we will be able to both obey our conscience, and our conscience will be pointing us in the right direction. So we come out okay. But that's the only solution.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, go ahead. You've been waiting longer anyway.
Okay, sorry. So within the sphere of Christianity alone, there already exists a certain amount of tension between ideas on morality at best and even outright contradiction at the worst. So my question would be, how do we...
Just 1 second. Do you mean different kinds of Christians disagree with each other?
Differences in doctrine, essentially.
Yes, okay, sure.
So my question would be how we practically strike the balance between building our lives on a foundation of truth while remaining humble and realizing that our specific ideas might not be the whole truth.
Well, okay, you should be open to criticism. You should consider what other people say. Rather than, when you're criticized, you shouldn't, it's wrong, of course, to just say, shut up, or I'll shut you up if you don't shut yourself up. But it's also wrong, to just, to think, oh gosh, you criticize me, I might be wrong. Who knows what's true, and fall into the relativist trap. What we should do when we're criticized is consider the criticism carefully and see if we might be wrong. And if we aren't, try to correct the other person. Okay? I mean, I think that of some of these differences among different kinds of Christians, I think that there are answers to some of them. Right. Yes?
Thank you so much for coming and speaking today. I really appreciated your talk.
Okay, thank you.
So, and actually I'm going to kind of piggyback off the question that was just asked. I guess to what standard, or how might Christians who hold different doctrinal beliefs, or perhaps maybe not even different doctrinal beliefs, but different conceptions of what the Bible teaches, or what the Christian church ought to believe, how would you recommend that we go about resolving those differences, or are there some things that just ought to stay as they are and not be resolved?
I would say talk to each other. People get into their little holes, and they don't talk to the other side. People will say, oh, those Exians, or Exilics, They're all wrong, and this is what they say. And you want to actually talk to those people to see what they really believe. Find out what they really believe and why. And this is not necessarily the same as asking the ordinary person who belongs to that church or that denomination, oh, what do you Lutherans believe? What do you Catholics believe? People are not always informed about the teaching of their own communions. And you have to look to the fundamental documents of their faith and see. And then you might have to argue. And that's okay. Just be courteous about it.
Yeah. Thank you.
Sure.
Lightning round, go.
Oh. First of all, thanks for coming to speak. My question has to do with ethics. What would you consider to be the difference between morality and ethics? And how does that...
I use the word synonymously.
Really?
Yeah, ethics is, if you want to speak Greek, ethics can mean a way of life. But morality is about which is the right way of life, right? I use the words to mean the same thing. I do distinguish between ethics and meta-ethics. Ethics is how we should live. Meta-ethics is theories, is the study of theories of how we should live instead of the study of how we should live.
Fair enough.
Okay?
Thank you.
What is the criteria that any sort of higher institution such as government can say that it is morally in the right?
It isn't in the right just because it's the government. It's in the right because what it says is in accord with the moral law. Okay? Okay.
If God and morality are one and the same, and morality is the basis of the state, then what are the implications of this for American principles of freedom of religion and separation of church and state?
Well, there's no problem. You got to figure out, for instance, why would we? Gosh, if God is the ultimate criterion of right and wrong, shouldn't the state be intolerant? Shouldn't it be illegal to be an atheist or to not to be a Christian or something? No, as Saint Hilary of Poitiers said, God does not desire an unwilling obedience. As the Puritan writer Roger Williams remarked, the sword, by which he meant governmental coercion, does not make a nation of faithful people; it makes a nation of hypocrites. Okay, so religious intolerance certainly does not follow from this. As a matter of fact, to follow the moral law, the state is going to have to honor the moral liberty to pursue the truth about God.
Okay, I know there's still a couple questions. I'll let y'all answer afterwards. And my apologies to the other people on Twitter who didn't get to ask. Although I think some of the Twitter questions came up at the microphone too, so
good.
That worked out really well.
Yes, sir.
For our crowd, again, let's thank our speaker for coming here tonight. So.
Thank you.
So, everyone have a good night. Again, the Christian Faculty Network and the Catholic Faculty and Staff Network and Ratio Christi are really happy to make this happen. Veritas is going to happen next year, and it's probably going to be a multi-night event. One last thing before I go out the door, I noticed our speaker has not hawked his own book, but I read, when I was your college student's age, I read his book, What We Can't Not Know. Go buy it. With that, I'll leave you to it. Good night.
Okay. Thank you for your welcome.